What do you know of the Bone Devil?
We are talking Devil's Night. That's Night with a K. And this is directed by Adam Worth and is produced by the Mahal Empire. And it's actually got a recognisable cast of named actors in smaller roles. Daniel Baldwin, Kevin Sorbo, Angie Everhart, Eric Roberts, of course. And but they're all in kind of small roles. And it's a sword and sorcery fantasy movie. Now, should you like this? Let me ask you, on the range of fantasy style content, are you a Game of Thrones fan or are you a Deathstalker fan? Because if the answer is Game of Thrones, this may not be the type of content for you. But if you are a Deathstalker fan, then you may want to check this one out. So yes, this one feels a lot like the early 80s Roger Corman produced sort of fantasy movies like Deathstalker, Sorceress, Barbarian Queen, that type of thing. So what is the story? It actually has kind of two halves to the story. It primarily focuses on a group of monster slayers, and they are hired by this kingdom to take out this particular monster called a Bone Devil, I believe it's called. And the initial part of the movie is this court, and they tried to have a little bit of scheming and things, people behind their backs, obviously I think influenced by Game of Thrones, but essentially they hire this kind of group of monster hunters to kind of go and deal with this particular kind of monster, and then we're introduced to this kind of group of mercenary sellsword types, and they go off and obviously are sent to deal with the monster. And the second half of the movie is them coming back to court and then dealing with a mess at this particular kingdom. That's all I'll kind of say in regards to the plot. That is problematic in different reasons, but there are still monsters. What will happen? You will have to watch the movie and find out. So this is a lower budget movie, and it's obviously quite a ambitious movie because you have to not only fill out this world with lots of extras, all in costume, you've got to think about the locations and stuff like this, and it being about monsters, obviously there's kind of monsters and things as well. So it's a little bit like science fiction movies. The larger in scale sort of low budget movies sometimes are a little harder to pull off than, say, maybe a horror, which is a little bit easier to do on a budget. But how did they do? What works in this movie? So one thing I would say that I think does work pretty well is the practical VFX. Now, we actually get a variety of different monsters show up in this movie, and they're all produced via practical VFX, practical makeup, men in suits, that sort of thing. And yes, arguably you could say it kind of looks like a man in a suit, yes. But I gotta say, I think for the budget of this movie, I think these practical makeup, these suits, look awesome. I actually really like the look of these kind of creatures. And there's one with like wings, and yes, the wings look like they're just made of cloth. But, you know, again, I think if you're watching a film like this, you're probably going to be a little bit forgiving with some of the kind of the rough around the edges, you know, look to some of this stuff. But for the most part, I thought these creature effects were fabulous. They looked awesome. They looked cool. You know, with the one with the wings is out, you know, it flies off from time to time, where we get a kind of like horned one, we get a minotaur, we get a kind of like demonic witch sort of thing. So there's a cool variety of monsters and things like that. And I have to say, I think they are well realised. I think they looked cool, they looked threatening, and the kind of just the way they're acting and stuff, I was impressed. Number two, what goes kind of hand in hand with that, this movie actually is relatively gory, with some kind of gory deaths, faces getting pulled off and things like that. Again, produced practically. Then they have added a few CGI blood squirts, which I think was a mistake, but there is still a good amount of practical gore and things like that, you know, intestines being pulled out and the like. So yes, I mean, it's not like, we're not talking Terrifier levels here, but for a fantasy movie, this is a little more gory than maybe, you know, maybe a lot. So there's that. And I also have to say as well, there is some fairly good sort of stunt work. There's quite a lot of action in this movie. There's a variety of different conflicts and fights. And I've got to say, I think they're all done fairly well. I actually thought the stunt work here and the kind of the choreography and the fighting is done pretty good, and I kind of quite liked the kind of the action sort of side of things. So, and like I've said, for the budget, it's fairly impressive in regards to the sort of scale here that they are trying to achieve. Which leads me to what doesn't work. I mean, there are budgetary restraints, that being said. Number one, this group of kind of sellsword mercenary types seem to travel everywhere by foot, and surely they'd be mounted, otherwise they just wouldn't get anywhere. So obviously, if you're a fan of, you know, fantasy content, you know, sword and sorcery stuff, obviously the mode of transport is mounted transport, and they don't have it, they just walk everywhere. And I'm thinking, oh, that doesn't seem like practical, but it's probably more of a budget issue rather than anything else. But there are things here that do betray the low budget, and that is one of them, just for example. Now, I've likened this to Deathstalker and that sort of style of movie, but it's Deathstalker with the modern audience in mind. Let me just say that. And it sort of isn't quite as TNA, for example, as the original Deathstalker, or quite as, you know, of that sort of period. It is very much, that's the one difference with this, and I would say those sort of style of movies. It does feel like it has more modern sensibilities in mind, which may or may not be a good thing depending on obviously your personal preference, but it's worth mentioning. I think the story here is a little bit of a mess, to be honest. For some reason, we have a framing device where one of the monster hunters is telling a group of other people about his adventure, but I didn't really think that needed to be there. To be honest, it didn't really seem to add anything to the story. In actual fact, I think it somewhat undercuts the story, because ultimately you can figure out that something's actually happened, because there's just this one monster hunter there left. You think, okay, so clearly something has happened to the rest of them. So it's one of those things where they have, for example, they have a scene at the beginning of the movie that actually takes place at the end of the story, then kind of work back. I really hate that trope, because I really do feel it kind of deflates tension, because you know the status quo at that point of time, and it's the same with this. So I wouldn't have done that. But outside of that, like I said, this movie feels like it has more of a 2-act structure rather than a 3-act structure. And we have these sort of encounters with this this monster group, this mercenary group. And then the second half of that kind of feels somewhat sort of disconnected from the first, almost like it's like another episode. So you can imagine this would be like a TV show that would, you know, that would feature this group of sellswords, and every week they would have to kind of deal with a particular threat. This feels like 2 episodes of a TV show that doesn't exist. It's just the way it feels. And then some of the kind of the issues, this kind of the machinations that this movie is trying to have with this kind of court, it feels particularly kind of underdeveloped. Like, you know, look, you take Eric Roberts' character, for example. He's in like maybe 2 scenes, and you know, he's kind of whispering in the king's ear, and it's kind of, his character is, you know, it doesn't go anywhere. The plot point doesn't really matter. And there are a few other characters from kind of non-named actors, so to speak, that don't really feel that they really had much to do, to be honest. The cast is quite big, and I think the movie suffers from having too many characters that are not particularly defined. And that's what I was kind of saying with this kind of like this modern sensibilities here. people are either talking in kind of like modern American English, or they're talking in a French accent for some reason, including Angie Everhart. So it's kind of weird, a weird mix of, like I say, a very modern sounding sort of dialogue and line readings and stuff, with these kind of weird fake French accents that are in for some of the characters as well. It's just some bizarre choices that are made here. So overall, I think if you just want to watch this for some fun things on screen, some fun monsters, some fun fights, you know, some reasonable kind of like costumes and stuff like that for the budget, then you'll have a good time. But if you actually want to watch this for a story with in-depth characters, then that is where this movie is lacking. And I think some of the choices here to really modernise it, again, you know, this doesn't really feel like it's a kind of European sort of style fantasy movie in some ways. Not that it necessarily has to be, but it maybe feels like with the kind of the way characters are talking and things like that, that it just feels a little bit like people are cosplaying more than anything else. So I'm going to give this one a 5 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.